Hello, and welcome to Learn Linux Now. I am your host, Edward. This is session number 4 in my series of videos where I attempt to teach you how to use Linux. And of course, the best way of learning anything, in my opinion, is by doing. So we're going to touch on in this session on the different methods of using Linux. And first and foremost, I'm definitely going to recommend using a virtual machine. This way is probably the easiest and probably best way of kind of easing into using Linux. And not only is it, ease of use in a sense, is it allows you to even try different versions of Linux distributions, either being a desktop or even a server if you want to. At one time, you can install multiple virtual machines, of course, depending on how much resources you have on your physical machine and your host. But it allows you to try different versions to see which one you like to use. And first virtual machine software that I'm going to recommend is a free version, and it's VirtualBox. Oracle has their version of a virtual machine software called VirtualBox, and it's completely free. You can install it on Windows, Mac, and if there are those out there who are already running Linux, you can install it on Linux also. But I definitely recommend installing VirtualBox on your machine. Again, keep in mind on how much resources you have. When using a virtual machine, it's not really recommended to use that on any machine that has 4 gigs of memory or less. I mean, you can try it. You might be a little slow, but it's not recommended. At the very least, you should have at least 8 gigs of memory and a good processor, fast processor. But I think the memory resources is where you're going to need to make sure you have plenty of. And some of the other ones to mention too, they are not free. They are paid versions that you require a purchase. Our VMware Workstation for Windows, and I think they make a version for Mac also. And then one of the more popular ones for Mac is Parallels. Now, in my list there, I have a few more listed that actually require you to already have Linux installed, and that's QuickEMU and KVM. And those are actually a little bit more of a learning curve there. It requires an intermediate or advanced user. And then also Proxmox virtual environment. And this is basically a distribution in of itself. So if you have a dedicated hardware, say you go to eBay and buy like a little Intel NUC with about 16 gigs of memory, or any other kind of server hardware that has a lot of resources, you can install Proxmox as a distribution in of itself to be a virtual machine server to host all your virtual machines. And this is a pretty popular server OS that I think is even being used in some enterprises. Again, a free distribution that you can install and run multiple virtual machines. So if you're feeling a little adventurous, sure, go out to eBay or somewhere and buy you a decent desktop machine or server machine that has plenty of resources and install Proxmox. That's another way of doing it. And of course, a physical machine. That's of course. I mean, if you have, say, for instance, a spare laptop laying around that's not being used, wipe it and install Linux on it. Of course, I would recommend backing up any data you have on it first before you wipe it, but that's another way of learning Linux, and it might be a little bit more of a run before you walk means. And whereas a virtual machine, you're kind of crawling a little bit before you walk. But that is definitely one of the better ways of learning Linux, is just installing it on a physical machine. And even again, a more advanced means is by dual booting if you already have Windows installed, and I think you can do it on a Mac. On a Mac also is a dual boot. You partition your drive, of course, backing up your data beforehand, and install Linux on that spare partition. And then a Raspberry Pi seems to be popular these days. Unfortunately, at the time of this recording, it's kind of difficult to find a Raspberry Pi, but that is a really good method of learning Linux. Have it running, sitting over on your over on the side as a basically. I actually use Raspberry Pis for my server as a server in my lab here at home. But a Raspberry Pi is a great way of learning Linux, and there's even dedicated Raspberry Pis out there. I think they're called the P400 that has a monitor built in, I believe, if I remember correctly. But yeah, definitely install a physical machine. That's a great way of learning Linux. And stay tuned for upcoming sessions where I actually detail a little bit more on using Linux, especially getting a little bit more into installing applications and using Linux itself. But for now, I'm going to ask you to take care of yourself and be kind.